Midnight smeared across Main Street like a misfired projector, throwing long shadows that eroded the curb edges into ghostly silhouettes. Neon halos bled through weathered glass, scribbling warnings in languages the city forgot to speak a decade ago. The wind carried the taste of rain that hadn't fallen yet, a promise of something coming that the street seemed to remember better than the people walking it. And somewhere in the distance, an old clock tower ticked out of time, each hollow bell syncing with a pulse nobody admitted listening for, except the ones who believed time itself could be hacked, if you knew the right private key. The first glitch came as a flicker at eye level. A Letterman jacket dissolved into something lighter, woven from light and memory, and then reassembled again into a second-hand fabric that never quite fit the person wearing it. The second glitch went up a notch, a whole storefront sliding sideways by a half step and then snapping back, leaving a dividend of dust motes floating on a timeline that wasn't supposed to exist in this particular place. People pressed against one another as if the street itself were a tide and they were boats without anchors. Yet most of them kept walking as if nothing had happened, as if the world merely hiccuped and continued to breathe. Rey moved with the caution of someone who had learned to read the weather in stone. She wasn't tall, not by anything resembling fashion or fashion's memory. She was compact, sinewed with the kind of lean power that came from years of crossing lines that didn't exist on any government map. Her hair was short enough to brandish in a silhouette when street lamps blinked in and out. The coat she wore, gray first, then carbon black as the night leaned into itself, held a dozen pockets, each one a little more dangerous to pry into than the last. Her eyes, the color of a storm you hadn't earned the right to weather, scanned the street with a soldier's patience and a hunter's hunger. A rebel in her own module of the city, a gene-pure zealot who believed that identity human, unaffected, authentic, was a lineage that should never be blended beyond a certain boundary. Yet Rey wasn't alone on this midnight walk. She trailed a figure who was the city's dark rumor made flesh, someone people kept in corners and whispers and 1,000 unposted messages. Miriam's presence wasn't a noise so much as a waveform, an augmented outcast who moved with a magnet's gravity, drawing the world toward her, even as the world pushed back. Miriam wore the kind of augmentations that looked like a seam between humanity and machine had been deliberately stitched with care, the kind that drew both longing and fear in equal measure. Her eyes carried a soft luminescence, not the hard clinical glow of a lab iris, but something closer to starlight that learned your name and forgot it in the same breath. If Main Street were a breathing organism, one might say the three pasts, past, present, and the almost forgetting future, were breathing together now, overlapped like multiple film reels misaligned in a single projector. They flickered, not in a straight line of cause and effect, but in a mesh of potentialities, as if the city's memory had decided to dream in stereo. The old brick facades appeared with their original rust-green paint, but then the paint peeled away to reveal a layer of chrome, a second century's idea of what a storefront should look like, gleaming with a polish that hadn't existed until the tech-augmented era had learned how to sculpt light into money. Rey's path crossed Miriam's, as if two rivers had found a fault line and decided to flow together for a breathless moment, before slicing apart again. The moment lasted for the length of a heartbeat, which in the city's clockwork meant a dozen lives felt the pavement shift under their boots. Their eyes met, two mirrors, not identical, but made in the same factory, and then tempered by different hands. "You're early," Miriam said, voice low, tinted with static that suggested an implant had hiccuped in its throat. "Or late, depending on which timeline you're reading." "Neither," Rey replied, letting the words settle between them like a coin dropped into a dark well. "I'm exactly where I'm supposed to be. You're not where you're supposed to be, not where you think you are, either." Her hand tucked into a pocket, fingering the weight of a small, irregular object there, something she kept close not for danger, but for memory. Miriam's lips twitched into a half-smile that looked more like a glint of light on a blade than a friendly gesture. The city keeps its promises with a rotten sense of humor. "You came to shadow me again, Rey? Or are you waiting for me to shadow you first?" The question wasn't a taunt. The question was simply true. Rey wasn't here for sport, not merely. She hunted something in Miriam, the way a cat hunts a lantern's moth, something bright, something impossible. Something that could burn the night into another night. 3 pasts, Rey said, as if the words would ground the air, steady the senses. 3 histories with the same heartbeat. The present is a bridge between them and a trap for anyone who thinks they can walk it alone. We're on a street that learned to forget the word before. Miriam studied Rey with a measured calm, as if studying a storm to determine whether to duck or dance. You think you're the only one with a memory problem, she said finally. You think your genetic lines were written with a single ink? You're the one who needs to be careful. Your memories aren't yours only. They're borrowed from experiments and entanglements and a lab's stubborn insistence that identity can be measured, minted, and marketed. The city trembled then, a shallow tremor that ran through the pavement and stirred the leaves of a tree that bore the odd fruit of a species no longer found in any geography. The tremor wasn't physical alone. It was something deeper, something like a rumor made tangible. The phasing, tech-dimensional messaging, reality phasing. Identity Eraser was awake. The city wasn't just a stage for their conflict, it was a participant, a chorus singing back the lines of their argument. Beyond them, the street's advertisement boards flickered not with product pitches, but with memories vignettes of lives that had not happened here. Not in this particular Main Street sense of time. A mother's kitchen, a sailor's harbor, a child's playground, all overlaying into a single impossible montage. The 3 pasts pressed in on the present, like a crowd pressing against a door that could never fully close. Rey's mind wandered to the lab, to the evidence she'd seen tucked away in a file at the edge of memory's periphery. 2 names, 2 faces, 1 experiment, and a system that believed it could rinse a species of its history and call that cleanliness. The thought was not a plan, but a warning. If the pasts were merging, then something dangerous was waking on Main Street, something that wanted to be heard, wanted to be believed. Let's not pretend this is accidental, Miriam continued, stepping closer. Her augmented arms glinted, tiny micro-sutures catching the streetlight, a seamstress's craft in metal. The factions have trained for this moment. The 3 pasts theorists, the entanglement syndicate, the city's own. They designed this night for you to pick a side and us to pick apart your choices until nothing is left but a hinge bone and a hinge nerve. Rey's lips pressed into a line. The city owes us a memory. If the memory isn't ours, then it's a liability, she said. We're here to see if we can take back the city's tongue and put it back where it should be, in the mouths of the people who built this place and continue to rewrite it with every breath. The words landed like a challenge into a ring that had no bell. A ring where the stakes weren't measured in money, but in the shape of reality itself. A faint hum rose from the street. The sound of 1,000,000 micro-recorders waking from sleep and beginning to hum with a quiet, almost reverent energy. The phasing tech's whisper was a chorus in the walls, a rumor the city could hear, but only if its heart beat in sync with it. Together they watched the street breathe. The 3 pasts stood shoulder to shoulder, with the present old brick and new chrome and something else in between, something that refused to choose a single era to belong to. The haunting was not in the spectacle, it was in the choice each person would have to make, whether to align themselves with a heritage that insisted on keeping the lineages separate, pristine, and uncorrupted, or to join a broader, noisier chorus where identity was a shared artwork, messy and evolving, something you could see in someone's laughter as well as in the scars on their hands. Rey did not step away from Miriam. She did not draw the weapon she kept tucked away. Not yet. The moment demanded something different, a reversal, a turning point, a negotiation with the city's own hunger. Why Miriam? She asked, finally. Why an augmented outcast? Why not someone else? Why not the lab itself, or the city's grand brain, or the ones who engineered this problem in the first place? Miriam's gaze softened. It wasn't a retreat, exactly, more like a patient acknowledgement of truth. Because I have been a living rumor, I was altered as a child, a mistake changed into a survival mechanism. she said. My augmentations aren't just tools. They're a language. They're a confession to a city that has been allergic to difference for too long. If we're going to stand against erasing true selves, we'll need something that speaks across every difference. And your language will be, Rey pressed. Miriam drew closer, not threatening, but intimate in a way that made the street feel smaller, like a hollow between the two of them. A space where a decision could be made with no witnesses, except the city's past and future colliding in the same breath. Noise, she said quietly. Noise that refuses to be silenced. If the city wants to hear the truth, it must listen to the echoes of who we were and who we can be, when the pasts stop fighting each other for a moment and start talking to one another. Rey's breath grew shallow, the air in her lungs crisp with the electricity of a distant storm. The three pasts pressed in, not as a threat but as a possibility, an invitation to rewrite a history that had always claimed it was finished. The trap was not hidden, only subtle. A hum along the street's electrical grid, an old familiar note that tells you something is being forced to align with a tune it doesn't know. The city's server towers blinked in a practiced cadence, like a chorus of eyes opening and closing in time with a conductor's baton. Somewhere higher up, perhaps in a control room that no one actually used to control anything, a single projector descended from the ceiling and released a sliver of light across Main Street. A line of heat that skated over boots and made the dust glitter with suspended gold. It wasn't the sun's gold, but a borrowed, synthetic warmth, a lure that pulled at the edges of memory and promise. We're not alone in wanting to fix this, Miriam finally stated, almost to herself, as if confessing something she hadn't intended to reveal aloud. There are more like us out there, faces you'd recognize as ordinary people who know the cost of forgetting who they are. The phasing tech isn't just erasing what we are, it's rewriting what we think we remember we were. Then will be the line they cannot cross, Rey answered, her voice a clear, bright note cutting through the hum of the city. We'll show them the cost of turning identity into a product. A siren wailed somewhere far away, a sound that did not belong to any one lane, a cine call to arms in a place that wasn't sure it was a war zone, but knew it could be if it had to be. The divergence came, not as a thunderclap, but as a weaving pattern in the air, the three pasts knitting themselves into a lattice that now stretched across Main Street, then up into the sky, a silver web that connected every storefront, every passerby, every whispered rumor in the city's bloodstream. The lattice did not erase details, it amplified them, letting each thread glimmer as if it carried a tiny internal lantern. Under this lattice, time slipped into a gentle groove and then out again, as if the city itself were learning a new language of memory, one that could be spoken aloud by anyone brave enough to claim their right to be more than one version of themselves. In the first moment of this awakening, Miriam's implants pulsed with a soft electric blue, matching the glow of a memory retrieval shard that had been borrowed from a lab long since closed to the public. It wasn't a weapon in the classic sense. It was a key, a small piece of a lock that could either seal a slot in the fabric of reality or open it to a flood of possibilities. Rey's own device lay dormant in her pocket, an object the shape of a coin, but heavier, carrying the burden of a dozen decisions she hadn't yet made. It hummed a whisper that sounded suspiciously like a future she hadn't chosen yet. Her decision to keep it secret wasn't prudence, it was fear, the same fear that had kept her alive long enough to see this moment, to see what the city could become if it remembered to dream. The three pasts aligned, with a softly audible chorus, the sound of a gallery door opening, the creak of old floorboards. A child's laughter that felt out of place in a midnight street of corporate signs and stolen futures. It was not a sound you could pay for, not with credit, not with influence. It was the sound of possibility waking, the music of what a world might be if everyone who walked the street could choose to keep their own history intact, while still allowing history to speak in a language that included their neighbor's memory too. Here's what we're going to do, Rey said, more to herself at first than to Miriam, as if the act of speaking the plan aloud could make it real. We take the device that maintains the phasing grid and we break it. We split the weave where it's tightest, and let the strands go where they will. Not destroy memory, but democratize it. Not erase the past, but let the past stay with the present, and the future has to negotiate with them. Miriam's eyes widened, not with fright, but with the electric tremor of recognition. That's a gamble, she said, but the word carried a possibility more than a warning. Risky as all the times we've chosen to act on a chance that onlookers call desperation. Better desperate and free than safe and hollow, Rey replied. Stepping into the line of the lattice's glow, the city's memory stretched toward them in a living map. And in that map, they found a route, a pattern, a possibility of a door in the air. The choice the three pasts forced upon them was not simply a decision of method, but of moral gravity. Were they custodians of a genealogical line that must not be polluted by other lines? Or were they guardians of a narrative that included every life on the street? The ones who wore implants and the ones who did not, and the memory of this city as a living archive rather than a static document. The phasing tech was a machine designed for precise work, a thing of ambition and measured risk, a device that had learned to translate quantum entanglement into progress for some and fear for others. The lab where the entanglement experiments had begun had long since been shuttered, its walls repainted with the city's signature neutral tones, its corridors now filled with rumor and memory rather than equipment. The device lay in an abandoned power substation, a place the city's night dwellers avoided because it hummed with a quiet expectancy, like a sleeping dragon that could wake at any time and decide to burn the world with its breath. To reach it would require more than brute force. It demanded a reckoning with the city's own history, a willingness to hear voices that had never found a stage to speak from. Rey and Miriam moved as a pair now, their steps synchronous in a way that felt almost choreographed by the bond formed in moments like this, when danger becomes a language and survival a grammar exercise. They passed a corner bakery whose window showcased a cake designed to resemble a map of the city's subways and bus routes. The cake's icing pooled in small rivulets along the edge, a telltale sign that the kitchen staff had tried to fashion a map that would outlive the night. The bakery's bell chimed as they passed, a sound that should have been ordinary, but which, under the three pasts' influence, seemed to restructure the air around them, fragments of old conversations drifting through the scent of sugar and yeast. The first major decision point came at the intersection where a wall had once advertised a car dealership. Now the sign pulsed with a living light, the letters rearranging themselves in ways that suggested a memory of a slogan long since forgotten. It spelled out a message that felt almost like a dare. Remember, and you become responsible. Forget, and you become part of the forgetting's ledger. The sentence's final word shifted into a new arrangement that read, "Remember together." "Do you see it?" Miriam asked, almost whispering. Her augmented senses tuned to this town's new wave of memory. She heard the message as clearly as if someone had spoken it aloud. The pasts are not asking us to choose to erase one for the sake of the other. They're asking us to acknowledge that memory exists in more than one thread, and that those threads can be braided into a more complex, more honest fabric. Rey touched the pocketed device in her coat, feeling the small object's readiness to act. "We will braid, not cut," she replied. "We'll loosen the threads enough to let the three pasts interweave with the present, but we'll anchor them with the city's consent. If the city wants to keep its sense of real, then it must vote with its memory." "Vote," Miriam echoed, a faint smile crossing her face. It wasn't amusement. It was the stubborn hope that had kept her alive through a dozen surgeries and uncounted betrayals. "We'll give them a choice. We'll show them what it means to be free and what it means to be forever tied to a single story." The route to the substation required passing through a district that had once been known for its theater culture, now repurposed again into a public square of memory-sharing people, stood around in clusters, not as protesters or spectators, but as living panels in a human exhibition of identity. Each cluster, carried a small device, an earbud, a wrist implant, an implant that rested at the back of the neck, emitting a soft, harmonizing tone. It wasn't music or a warning. It was a calibration tone. A little instrument that allowed the city to harmonize its various pasts, to keep them from clashing into a violent collision. It was a regulation, a social hack that kept memory from becoming memory's weapon. This was perhaps the city's most radical invention, a social technology to regulate the memory storms. It wasn't perfect or uncontroversial, but it was something. And something, in a night when time itself had become a rumor, could be all a person could ask for. They found the substation, a hulking building whose facade looked as if it had once known sunlight and cold, dry air, and decided to forget both. The door was mismatched, a panel left cracked and half missing, so that a sliver of the interior's glow spilled into the street. The interior was an enormous chamber of wires and towers, a room whose walls hummed with the quiet light of servers, sleeping under the heavy blanket of a city's demand that someone somewhere keep the record of all its lives. Here the phasing grid pulsed at the core, a lattice of conduits and a brain of trans-temporal logic that made the pasts behave as if they were not pasts at all, but present possibilities, all of them accessible with a click or a whisper. The lab's memory was not a simple thing. It was a tidal pool of potential, a place where a person could listen to a version of themselves they had not yet become, and decide if they would still be themselves when the conversation ended. Rey and Miriam stood before the main console, a thing of chrome and glass that looked like a boat's helm, heavy and commanding. And yet, it seemed to invite touch, to accept a caregiver's hands rather than a vandal's aggression. A voice spoke, not from a speaker, but as if the room itself learned to project a person's tone into the air, like a memory becoming audible. It was the city's caretaker, an embodiment of the memory regulation network, perhaps. Or perhaps something else entirely. "You have arrived at the turning," it said, and its cadence suggested it had repeated this moment thousands of times before, only to forget with the next breath. "The phase is sensitive. Tampering will fracture more than it fixes. It will fracture you." "The phase has fractured us already," Rey replied, stepping forward, her eyes always on the device's core. "We're here to decide if we deserve to be fractured or to be made whole in a way that respects every past." The caretaker's voice softened, as if the room itself had learned empathy from watching humans endure their own choices for years. "Three pasts exist on the same stage tonight," it said. "Each deserves a voice. If you silence one, you silence what it means to remember a life lived across time. If you amplify all, you risk dissolving any person's sense of a single true story. A city will become a chorus with no clear melody." Miriam stepped closer to the console, her augmentations tracing lines of light that danced across the glass as if she were running a fingernail along a thin, luminous edge of probability. "Then we need a conductor who can hear all three voices simultaneously and still direct them toward a common psalm," she said. Rey and Miriam pressed their hands to the console, and the device responded, not with a shock, but with a shiver, a ripple along the lattice that ran along the walls, up through the ceiling, and into the street. The three pasts began to unfurl in the room like a book opening to the wrong page, pages turning by themselves, each page carrying a memory. A mother's kitchen, a sailor's harbor, a child's park, a scientist's lab, a street's forgotten corner. The present grew louder, as if it was the volume in the room's air, and the three pasts sang in counterpoint, weaving a chorus of lives that were separate in time, but now braided into one coherent moment. The memory storm swelled until it formed a shape in the air, a silhouette of a city's skyline, but with the edges softened, like a memory that has begun to dream of itself. From the edges of the chamber, a figure stepped forward. It was a man, or at least a silhouette of a man, indistinct enough that you could mistake him for a memory himself. He wore the uniform of a city administrator, the kind of clothes that signified power without leaving invisible scars on his skin. His mouth didn't move as he spoke, but his words brushed Rey's ears, as if a feather had found its way into her ear. "You have disrupted the order of your own calculation," he said, and his tone carried a calm certainty that suggested years of calibrating people to accept a reality that suited a few. "The device is not merely a trap, it is a map. It shows you where the city thinks your own identity should end. It reveals the limits you impose on yourselves. If you proceed, you will cause a fracture too deep to be healed." Rey looked at the silhouette, and for a moment she believed she would have to hurt it to protect what mattered. But the silhouette did not bend or lean toward violence. It spoke with a quiet sincerity that was almost unsettling. "We are not here to wreck the city," the silhouette said, if it could be said to speak. "We are here to rescue it from a fiction of sameness." The three pasts flashed a memory in unison. A memory of a future where everyone on Main Street wore the same face, spoke the same language, believed the same thing, the ultimate erasure of personal difference as a condition for peace. It was a memory Rey hadn't known she carried until this moment, a memory of a world where identity had become an endangered species, a fragile thing that could be hunted down and quarantined out of existence in the name of stability. The device hummed with a new intensity, and the room filled with a soft, luminous fog, as if the memory storm were exhaling, and the breath smelled of rain and copper, a scent that spoke of old industries and new possibilities. The fog carried whispers from the pasts, not as commands, but as questions, as if eternity had pressed its ear to the door and wanted to know what a people would choose if given a chance to be more than they were. "It's not too late," the caretaker's voice boomed again, softening into something almost human. "One of you can step away with the memory intact, and the other can stay and guide the city toward a future that respects plurality. It is not cowardice to choose partial preservation. It is a recognition that not all truths are meant to exist alone." Rey and Miriam looked at each other, and for a moment the two stared as if the other would suddenly disappear into a memory the city would forget to keep. "Or you can choose to merge them all," Miriam proposed, her voice a little brittle with the weight of risk. "You can propose a new memory, a shared archive that records every life as both a singular thread and a thread within a larger tapestry. It would be messy and beautiful and dangerous, but it would be real." Rey felt the device's hum settle into a rhythm that matched her own heartbeat, a luminous drumbeat that sounded like the city's old blood singing. The three pasts swelled into a single bubble, glistening with possibilities. The bubble didn't burst, nor did it settle. It held, temporarily, as if the memory storm was listening, waiting for a signal. "Tell the city you're listening," the caretaker urged, almost coaxing. "Tell them you hear them, and you will protect them, not from fear, but from the one idea that has always haunted them, the idea that their stories are less true if other stories stand beside them and speak with equal authority." Miriam stood tall, her augmentation architecture catching the light in such a way that she looked both fragile and indomitable. "We'll give them the stage," she said, the words a vow and a dare. "We'll give them the space to be more than one version of themselves, and to still call themselves human. If the city can hold that tension, it will be larger than any one of us and smaller than the sum of all of us, which is exactly how a real society should be." Rey stepped forward, the coin-like device in her pocket pulsing once, twice, then quiet. The weight of the moment pressed on her chest, as if the city itself was leaning in to listen to what she would choose. Her mouth formed the word before she fully understood it herself. "Yes." The decision rippled through the room, a stone dropped in a well, radiating out with circular waves that touched the lattice and the minds that clung to it. The device's core glowed brighter, then steadied, then expanded outward in a careful bloom. The wall of memory fog thickened in a protective layer, an atmosphere that could shelter more truths than one life could hold in its memory. The caretaker's silhouette stepped into the fog center, becoming a focal point of the three pasts' converging memory. Then, in a moment that felt like the city exhaling after holding a breath too long, the fog pulled back, and the three pasts stood, as if they had never been in conflict with the present at all. They stood now as a ring of 7 human stories, the three pasts themselves, and 4 present lives that now wore each past as a badge rather than a cage. And memory storms quieted to a curious hush, the kind of silence that follows a loud confession and invites a response. The substation's lights flickered in a pattern that looked suspiciously like a vote tally. The city's social devices across Main Street, those little calibrators people wore or kept in pockets, began to emit different tones, each tone corresponding to a choice, to a desire, to a future path. The whine of the phasing grid receded, not completely, but enough to suggest that the device's most intrusive function had been tamed, for a moment, by a collective will interested in something other than pure control. The three pasts, now visible with a new, shared consciousness, spoke not in single voices, but in harmonies. They spoke of mothers and daughters, of scholars and laborers, of artists and truant children who lived in the city's skeleton bones. They spoke of a plan that would save the memory of every person and would turn memory into a living practice rather than a weapon. If this plan failed, if this moment broke, then the three pasts would retreat into their own margins and the city would fall back into a quiet, respectful war where memory was a bargaining chip and the city's citizens were the debtors. "We aren't done yet," Ray said to Miriam, the two of them now standing side by side in a new, fragile quiet. The city's memory was listening, not only to the two of them, but to every person who had stood on this street and believed their story mattered. "We've chosen a future where memory is a shared resource, not a captured fossil. If we are to survive as a species, we must learn to live with each other's histories, to let them coexist, to let them speak without fear." Miriam nodded, a line of quiet determination running through her features. Her augmented circuits hummed with a gentle resonance, the city's memory threads weaving through her, like wind through a cathedral's arches. "The device is still here," she reminded Ray, "but it's not the same. We used it, we changed it. We asked it to obey a rule it hadn't previously recognized. Respect that a person is not just a track in a genealogical line, but a living, changing chorus of time's voices." They turned to the caretaker, who had revealed itself as more than a ghost in a machine, more than a government directive personified. It was a guardian of memory, yes, but also a participant in this new arch of time. Caretaker spoke again, this time with a warmth that suggested it too had learned something from this night's choices. "The city has chosen to remember," it said, the words wrapping around the chamber like a bright ribbon. "Not to erase the pasts, not to force the present to forget its lineage, but to create an architecture in which pasts are allowed to participate in the present. This is a form of citizenship, a form of humanity. An agreement to live with one another's stories, with the humility to know that every life matters, and a courage to cherish difference." The device's glow settled into a comfortable, even rhythm, a new heartbeat for the city's memory. A lattice, the three pasts' bond, had become a living ceiling of possibility rather than a weapon's blade. The memory storms had quieted into a respectful drizzle that did not erase but revised, did not erase but allowed the nettle of difference to persist and to be tended. Ray let out a breath she hadn't realized she'd been holding. It tasted of rain and iron and something like the first bite of dawn after a long, cold night. She looked at Miriam and found not a rival or an ally, but a partner in a project larger than either of them had anticipated, to reconfigure a city's conscience in a way that honored every single life within it. They stepped away from the console, not running, but walking with the confidence of two people who had learned the city's language in the space between fear and hope. The three pasts hovered at their periphery, not as ghosts, but as living testimonies to what could happen when a community chooses to face itself honestly. Outside, the night's fog began to lift in places, revealing spires and rooftops bathed in a pale, hopeful light. The clock tower's hand moved once, slowly, then resumed its ordinary cadence as if the night had decided to grant itself an extra moment of quiet before the world decided whether it would wake more boldly or more cautiously. Main Street didn't forget, it remembered. It remembered a time when it had known separation and a time when it had learned how to hold many identities in one breath. It remembered the fear that surrounded the erasure of self, and it remembered the courage that allowed a person to claim their own story even when others believed there was no need to fight for it. It remembered the two people who had confronted its darkest impulse and had chosen to write a brighter future instead. The future they'd chosen wasn't a neat, clean victory. It was an ongoing negotiation, a continuous act of memory stewardship that would require vigilance, generosity, and the willingness to be wrong and to admit it and to correct course in the next moment. It was a city learning to be human in public, where identity was not a private fortress but a shared city square. Rey looked at Miriam, their eyes catching in a brief, charged moment of mutual recognition, their differences not erased but given space to breathe. The memory's new architecture could not be tested in a single night. It would take days, weeks, years of living with the choice they had made, to let the three pasts walk with the present, and to allow the future to listen to the old stories as it authored new ones. A first dawn after the night's events arrived not with a blaze of triumph, but with a soft, persistent light that made the city's edges seem sharper and more possible. On Main Street, the storefronts gradually reacquired their old colors and textures, but with an added shimmer, the recognition that each facade carried a memory, and that every memory belonged to someone who walked the street, ate at its diners, bought its newspapers, and liked the same old songs sung just a touch differently in the city's throat. People woke with a sense of relief, yes, but also with a quiet curiosity. They asked questions in muted tones. Where had the night's fierce energy gone? Why did the street feel lighter and heavier at the same time? Who were the two figures who'd stood in the substation and dared to propose a new memory for everyone? Rey and Miriam walked through the first hours of daylight, as if they were two travelers returning to a familiar place after an extended, dangerous journey. They spoke softly, not to conceal, but to calibrate, to translate their shared experience into something a bank robber or a politician could not steal or weaponize. They spoke about the future's responsibility and about how a city's memory must be safeguarded the same way one would safeguard a family photograph, not to worship it, but to remember its truth and to let it guide you toward a future you could believe in. The city's voices, which had once rising in a cacophony of fear and fascination, began to harmonize into a chorus that sounded like a promise. People started telling their own stories more openly, as if the night's events had opened a door that permitted the slow, careful telling of truths across generations. The old rumor of erasure, the fear that the past would vanish and leave only a sanitized present, began to fade. In its place grew a more complicated but more honest fear. A fear that memory, if not properly tended, could become a weapon of control as easily as a shield of identity. Rey and Miriam knew that this peace was unstable, that the city would test it with another storm, another lapse of memory's integrity, another temptation to pretend that the past should be kept in separate rooms behind locked doors. But for now, the three pasts, and the present that had learned to live with them, stood as witnesses to a choice that could be repeated and improved, a method for a species to grow without losing itself in the process. The twist, if one could call it a twist, wasn't that Rey's memory wasn't wholly her own or that Miriam's augmentations came with a price. The real surprise was the city's reaction to the idea of a shared memory, not as a threat, but as a responsibility, and that responsibility could be accepted if the people who inhabited Main Street were willing to cooperate with one another, to regard each other's stories with reverence, and to treat identity as a living, evolving art rather than a fixed, private relic. As the day stretched toward noon, the two walked side by side toward a plaza where performers began to rehearse a new kind of theater. A performance of everyday life that acknowledged its own fragility and celebrated its resilience. The crowd gathered, not to witness an act of rebellion or a spectacle of villainy, but to participate in a communal exercise of memory. A practice of remembering together. The city's moderators announced that the night's events had been a trial of humanity's willingness to accept plurality. And the crowd responded with applause that wasn't quite laughter, wasn't quite relief, but something more akin to gratitude. In the weeks that followed, the city began to implement a new system of memory governance. Phasing tech still existed, still hummed in the background, but it was now a tool with strict boundaries, a device that could help the city recall the right fragments of itself, not to erase anyone's history, but to ensure that every person could acknowledge the histories of others and still return to their own. The device had become, in effect, a public resource rather than a private weapon, a memory library that housed every life in a form that allowed for cross-illumination rather than cross-erasure. Rey and Miriam did not disappear into the background of this transformation. They remained central, not because they commanded the city, but because the city's memory needed witnesses who could translate the night's lessons into daily practice. They taught, they listened, they allowed themselves to be changed by the city's new breath of legitimacy and fearlessness. They learned to walk the same street with a different understanding, that identity is not a line drawn in the sand, but a living road, constantly repaved by those who chose to walk it and by those who chose to remember it. 3 months later, on a dawn that bore the same promise of renewal, but with a slightly wiser edge, Main Street woke to the gentle sound of conversations, threaded with laughter, rather than the alarm of an imminent danger. People spoke about their own histories, about the memory they carried in a pocket or in the soft fiber of their gloves, about the way a single memory could be a seed from which many lives grew. A young girl told her grandmother that she wanted to learn to dance with the memory of a grandmother she had never known, and the grandmother nodded, the lines in her face smoothing in a way that suggested hope more than exhaustion. A man who had once stood in the crowd with a skeptical look on his face now walked with a slight, almost shy smile, his eyes reflecting the store windows where a dozen versions of his street life flash-fed from one memory to another, each version smiling back at him with a truth he was now ready to accept. A mother explained to her son that a memory wasn't something you stored in a drawer. It was something you wore, like a coat that could be passed down to a child who would wear it differently, but not claim it didn't belong to them. And through it all, Rey and Miriam walked the pavement where 3 pasts had found a way to sit down at the table of the present and tell their stories to a future that had promised to listen with more than courtesy. They stood there not as exiles from time, but as stewards of it, guardians who knew that the future's clarity depended on the past's honesty, and the present's courage to carry both forward together. When the day finally ceded to night, and the street lights flickered on again in patient, ceremonial fashion, the city's memory had become a map not of where it had been, but of where it could go, if its people chose to walk with their neighbors, if they allowed themselves to be imperfect and still try to do better. The 3 pasts, now not rivals but companions, sighed in contentment and stepped back into the streets of the city, each leaving behind a thread that would, in a quiet way, continue to intertwine with everyone else's. Rey looked at Miriam, and for the first time she felt almost certain of a future she hadn't dared to predict. The future would require more conversations like tonight's, more nights when the city's memory had to be coaxed into telling the truth without fear of losing the past it clung to. The future would require not a single decisive act, but a ripple of small acts, a chorus of decisions to be repeated again and again as the city's memory matured into something more robust. The memory of a community that could hold many histories at once and still insist on calling itself human. As they walked away from the plaza, the city's voice rose, not as a shout, but as a chorus, singing the words that had become the night's new creed. We remember together, and in remembering, we become more than we were. We become capable of bearing the truth that every life matters, and that a memory kept in common is a life shared by many. We become a city that can hold the weight of its own past and still stand tall enough to dream a future that includes all its people. Midnight returned to Main Street not as a moment of danger, but as a memory of transformation, an event that the city would tell as a beginning, a turning, and a promise. The three pasts did not vanish. They did not shrink to quiet, private footnotes. They lived on in the faces of the street, in the glint of every implant's glow, in the careful, patient feet of those who walked with Ray and Miriam toward an uncharted dawn. And in that dawn's pale light, the city, their city, found a new phrase for its own existence. Identity, finally and forever, as a shared thing, a living archive. A canvas on which every person could leave a mark that was theirs alone, and yet could be understood by others, not as a threat, but as a neighbor's story begging to be heard. Ray and Miriam had catalyzed a change they could not claim as conquest. They had answered a question the city did not know how to ask until they stood on its streets and dared to speak the truth aloud. That humanity was not a collection of tidy lines, but a living, evolving chorus, where each voice, each memory, could sing its part without fear of erasure and with hope that the harmony would outlast the night. The world beyond Main Street would test this new arrangement. Of course, the old powers might still tremble at the thought of a citizenry that refused to surrender its pasts, a governance that recognized memory as a public good rather than a private asset. There would be challenges, maybe even threats, but if the city proved anything, it was that when three pasts align in moment of courage and choice, the future could be generous enough to hold them all. And so, under the pale, patient dawn, a city woke with a memory that would not be easily forgotten. A memory of three pasts interwoven with a living present and a future that promised to listen and to learn, to remember and to become, together,